Very good evening to all of you, and a warm welcome to all our viewers who have joined us on the show. Welcome to the YouTube channel Skepta. I'm your host, Dr. Mani Iyer. Before we start, I request every one of you to please kindly subscribe to this channel, share this channel, as well as like this video. Share this channel to all your friends and relatives, and this will go in a long way in supporting us and help us much more videos, podcasts, and shows like this. We can bring them to you. All right, let's begin. When we hear about a teenager planning a serious crime, we often focus on the crime itself. But what if we look at the abilities behind that behavior? The thinking, the planning, the problem solving, and execution that went into it. Sometimes a young person may have a remarkable critical thinking and problem solving abilities, but those strengths are being directed towards unhealthy or destructive ideas. So, what happens when we identify those abilities early and redirect them towards something productive, like academics, hobbies, skills, or even a future career? So, in welcome to the episode 2 of Understanding Young Minds. Here, where we are going to explore exactly that through another anonymized case conversation with psychologist Miss Ayesha Khaleel. Ayesha Khaleel ji, please welcome to the show. We'll we look beyond in this show. We look beyond the offense and understand how a young person's strength can sometimes be hidden within problematic behavior and what it means to channel those strengths in a healthier direction. So let's dive deeper. Aisha ji, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Maniji. And I'm really happy to be back with another episode of Understanding Young Minds.
Thank you.
So, yes, in our previous episode, we spoke about a young boy involved in repeated thefts and explored how behavior can gradually become learned and reinforced. So, today's case is very different. And the psychological theme I want to explore through this case is something that really stood out to me during my time working with children in conflict with law. So sometimes when we look at a young person who has committed a serious offense, we immediately focus on everything that's going wrong. Like, for example, poor judgment, aggression, risk taking, antisocial behavior, and obviously those things need to be addressed. But sometimes underneath those problematic behaviors, you can actually see very strong abilities, like very strong mental abilities. For example, intelligence, critical thinking, problem solving, planning, decision making, and etc. The ability to think several steps ahead. So, the problem isn't necessarily the absence of ability. Sometimes the problem is where that ability is being directed. And today's case is a very interesting example of exactly that. Before we begin, as always, I'll be referring to this young person simply as X, and identifying details have been omitted or changed to maintain confidentiality. And the purpose of discussing this case is purely educational. And I also want to make something very clear from the beginning. Understanding the psychology behind an offense does not mean admiring, minimizing, or justifying the offense itself. So, we are going to talk about certain cognitive abilities or the mental abilities X displayed, but we are not praising how those abilities were used. We are asking a completely different question here. So, the question is what happens when a young person has strong abilities but begins using them in destructive ways? And can those same abilities be redirected towards something healthier? So, this is our main question that I'll be addressing. So, let's talk about X here. X was around 19 years old when I met him, and one of the first things I noticed while interacting with him was that he could think, and I mean really think, using his own mind. He wasn't someone who simply answered whatever question was put up in front of him. He would pause before responding, think through what was being asked, and then give a very well structured answer. During our counseling sessions, I noticed that he liked analyzing situations and reacting impulsively in conversation. The more I spoke with him, the more I realized that he possessed good reasoning skills. He was able to connect events, explain his thought process clearly, and think several steps ahead. As a psychologist, those are qualities you naturally notice because they tell you something about how a person's mind processes information. Now, X was there in connection with an extremely serious offense. There had been an ongoing conflict between him and one of his friends. According to X, the friend had repeatedly abused and insulted him during their disagreements and arguments. Over time, those incidents stayed with him. Instead of addressing the conflict, walking away from the friendship, or finding a healthier alternative to cope up with his anger, he continued thinking about it and he continued planning about it. So, what had started as a conflict gradually became something much bigger in his mind. Eventually, he reached a point where he decided that he wanted to kill his friend. So, one of the reasons this case stayed with me was because this wasn't simply an impulsive act carried out in the heat of the moment. He did not do that impulsively or suddenly in the moment. So there was planning involved, like meticulous planning. X had already thought about where he wanted the incident to happen. He chose an isolated mountainous area where there would be very few people around. He planned how he would take his friend there. He had also thought about what he would do after the incident. He had considered how he might leave the area and avoid getting caught. As we continued discussing the case, it became very clear that this wasn't random. His mind had moved through a sequence, like a series of events. First, there was the conflict, then came the decision, after that came the planning, and finally, execution of the plan. Now, I want to pause here and make something very clear. None of this makes the offense any less serious. Planning a violent crime is deeply concerning, and nothing I'm saying today should be interpreted as admiration for that planning. So, but as psychologists, we are trained to understand how people think and not just what they did. And while listening to X, I found myself asking a different question here. What kind of abilities does planning actually require? So, here, if we remove the offense itself for just a moment, planning involves anticipating the future events, organizing information, considering obstacles, weighing different possibilities, and connecting one step to the next. Those are all cognitive abilities. We use those same abilities in everyday in healthy situations. For example, a student uses them while preparing for examinations, an entrepreneur uses them while building a business, a doctor uses them while planning treatment, an engineer uses them while solving a technical problem. The abilities themselves are not harmful. What becomes harmful is the purpose they are being used to serve. And that's exactly what stood out to me in X's case. The disturbing part wasn't that he lacked the ability to think. So, the disturbing part was that his thinking had become organized around a destructive goal, like a very destructive goal. That became one of the biggest focuses during our counseling sessions. It was not that how do I remove your ability to plan, because planning itself is an incredibly valuable life skill. Instead, the question became, how do we redirect this ability towards something that helps you build a life instead of destroying one? So I'll repeat that question once again. How do we redirect this ability towards something that helps you build a life instead of destroying someone else's? Sometimes, when young people display intelligence through problematic behavior, we become so focused on stopping the behavior that we forget to notice the strength underneath it. If a teenager can think strategically, solve problems, and plan ahead, those are abilities that can eventually help them succeed in education, employment, leadership, and many other areas of life. The challenge is helping them discover healthier ways of using those strengths. And I think that's an important distinction. Sometimes, when young people display their intelligence through problematic behavior, adults become so focused on eliminating the behavior that we completely overlook the underlying ability. Suppose a teenager is exceptionally good at finding loopholes. Our immediate reaction might be this child is manipulative, and perhaps the behavior really is manipulative and needs to change. But there's another question worth asking: what ability is underneath it? And can this person anticipate how other people might respond? Can they think strategically? Can they identify weaknesses in a system? Can they generate alternatives quickly? Because some of those same abilities that they use in manipulation or other destructive activities, when these abilities paired with empathy, ethics, discipline, and a healthier goal, can become very useful strengths. And that was one of the most interesting things for me about X. The issue wasn't that he couldn't think. The issue was that his thinking had become organized around a destructive goal, that, that is, like planning to kill someone. That completely changes how we approach rehabilitation. Because now we are not only saying, don't do this, we are also asking, what else could you do with this mind and with this ability?
Yeah, so that's a very different way of looking at the case, Aishna ji, because when we hear about that level of planning behind a serious offense, we naturally see it only as something frightening. But you're saying the underlying abilities, planning, critical thinking, and problem solving, aren't inherently bad. It's the way they are being used that's problematic. So, how do you separate the strength from the harmful behavior and actually begin redirecting it?
Exactly, Dr. Maniji. And I think this is where we have to be very careful with the way we interpret behavior. I'm absolutely not saying that because someone planned a crime, we should admire or praise that planning. What we are doing is separating the cognitive ability from the behavior itself, like their mental strengths and their talents from the behavior which was offensive. Those are two very different things. Planning, critical thinking, and problem solving are not negative qualities. In fact, they are qualities that most of us try to develop throughout our lives. We encourage children to think independently. We teach students to solve problems. Employers look for people who can plan ahead and analyze situations and also make good decisions. These are valuable life skills. So, here, the concern arises when those same abilities begin serving destructive goals. So, let me give you a simple example. Imagine a student preparing for an important examination. They identify what subjects they are weak in, they make a timetable, they organize their study material, they anticipate challenges and prepare for them. That's planning and problem solving being used in a healthy direction, in a healthy manner. Now, compare that with someone who has decided to take revenge for disagreements or conflicts. They also identify a goal. They also think about the steps involved. They consider obstacles. They prepare for different situations. And the thinking process may involve similar cognitive skills, similar to the students. But the purpose is entirely different. That's why we ask, can this person think? Like we also ask, what is the thinking working towards? Like, is it a healthy goal or a destructive behavior? And I think that's a much more meaningful question. So, during rehabilitation, one of our goals is to help young people realize that the very abilities that they have been using to make unhealthy decisions can also help them build a meaningful life. We are not trying to take away their intelligence, we are just trying to change its direction. Sometimes people believe rehabilitation simply means telling someone, don't do this again, or don't do that, it's a bad behavior. No, uh, this does not work or help them in a direct manner. The sustainable change usually requires something more than that. A young person needs another way to experience achievement, and another way to feel capable, another way to challenge themselves. Because if the only place they have experienced excitement, success, or control is through unhealthy behavior or through crimes, then simply telling them that to stop the behavior is not enough. We have to help them discover healthier alternatives. For someone who enjoys solving complex problems, that challenge might be found in academics. For someone who likes strategy, it might be chess, coding, engineering, or entrepreneurship. Someone who enjoys competition may find that same sense of excitement in sports. Others may discover it through creative projects like vocational training or learning a new skill. The activity itself may differ from one individual to another. The principle remains the same. We are helping them experience the satisfaction of using their abilities in ways that benefit both themselves and the people around them. Another important part of rehabilitation is changing identity. So, this is something very important. If a young person repeatedly hears the labels given by the society, like you are dangerous, you are a criminal, or you will never change, they may slowly begin accepting those labels as part of who they are. And once a behavior becomes someone's identity, change becomes much more difficult. Instead, we can communicate something different. We can hold them accountable for what they have done while also reminding that they are capable of making better choices. We can say, for example, what you did was wrong and you must take responsibility. But we can also say, I can see that you are intelligent. I can see that you can think ahead and plan meticulously. Let's explore how these strengths can help you build a different future or a different life. Those two ideas can exist together. Uh, Accountability and hope are not opposites. In fact, they often work best when they are combined. So, with X, our conversations gradually shifted from only discussing the offense to discussing his future. What interested him? What kind of work challenged him? What gave him a genuine a sense of achievement? What kind of person did he want to become? Those questions encouraged him to look beyond the mistake he had made and begin thinking about the life he could still create. Because ultimately, rehabilitation isn't only about preventing another offense, it's also about helping a young person discover healthier ways to use the abilities they already possess. Instead of finding satisfaction in harming someone, can they find satisfaction in building something? Instead of proving themselves through destruction, can they prove themselves through achievement? That's the shift we are trying to create. not by removing their abilities, but by helping those abilities find a healthier purpose. So, now we'll come to the next part, that is looking beyond the labels. So, as I mentioned, the society uh, creates so many labels for them that you are a criminal, or like put them under one umbrella of criminals. So, it's important that we look beyond the labels here. So another thing this case taught me is how easily we can reduce a person to the worst decision they have ever made. The moment someone is labeled as a criminal or an offender, that label often becomes the only thing people see. Everything else about them slowly disappears into the background. For example, their strengths, their interests, their talents, and even their potential. And while it's absolutely important to acknowledge the seriousness of an offense, it's equally important not to lose sight of the fact that we are still dealing with a human being. During my work with children in conflict with law, I met young people from very different backgrounds. Every child had a different story, different family environments, different life experiences, different personalities, and also different reasons for making the choices they did. That reminded me that there is no single profile of a child involved in crime. Sometimes people ask, what kind of child commits a crime like this? But in reality, there is not one simple answer. Some young people or adolescents are very impulsive by nature. Some are easily influenced by their peers, friends, and or the friend circle. Some struggle with emotional regulation. Others have experienced very difficult life circumstances like broken families or poverty. And some people, like X, demonstrate very strong cognitive abilities, but unfortunately use those same abilities in harmful ways. That's why, as mental health professionals, we try to understand the whole person rather than only the behavior. Because behavior tells us what happened. Understanding the person helps us explore why it happened and how change can become possible. Another important aspect is identity. So, adolescence and young adulthood are periods where people are still figuring out who they are. They are asking themselves questions like, what am I good at? Where do I belong? What kind of future do I want? Those answers are still developing. If a young person begins believing I'm just a criminal, or this is all I'll ever be, or I cannot change, I can never change. So that belief itself can become another obstacle to change those labels. But if we can help them recognize other parts of themselves, their intelligence, their creativity, their ability to solve problems, their willingness to learn, even their empathy. Yes, many people believe that criminals lack empathy, but this is not true. Then suddenly their identity becomes much broader than one offense. And that's where rehabilitation becomes so important. So, for example, education, vocational training, sports, creative hobbies, learning new skills, these aren't simply activities to pass time or just for time pass. They provide opportunities for young people to experience success in healthier ways. When someone begins receiving recognition for positive achievements instead of harmful behavior, it slowly changes how they see themselves. And I think that's something we should never underestimate because people are far more likely to protect an identity they are proud of than one they are ashamed of. So, of course, strengths are alone are never enough. Someone can be highly intelligent and still make very poor decisions. That's why rehabilitation isn't only about developing ability, it's also about developing empathy, emotional regulation, healthy values, responsibility, and perspective taking, and also learning healthier ways of dealing with conflict and frustration. When those qualities begin working alongside intelligence and critical thinking, that's where real growth starts to happen. And X's case reminded me of something I'll probably never forget. His ability to think wasn't the problem, the direction of his thinking was. So it made me wonder how different things might have been if those same abilities had been recognized earlier and channeled into something constructive and productive. We can never say with certainty that it would have prevented the offense. Human behavior is far too complex for that. But I do think it raises an important question for all of us. Are we only noticing young people when their ability is becoming a problem? Or are we identifying those abilities early enough to give them somewhere productive to grow? So, yeah.
Yeah, so uh, that's a good one. So essentially, rehabilitation isn't only about stopping the young person from committing another offense. It's also about helping them discover a completely different way of using their abilities they already have. Now, what does that redirection actually look like in a practical terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what does all of this actually mean in practice? In other words, in practical terms. If rehabilitation isn't simply about saying don't do it again, then what are we trying to achieve? For me, rehabilitation begins with helping a young person recognize that they are more than the worst decision they have ever made. They're much more than that. That doesn't mean removing accountability. Accountability and taking responsibility for what they did is absolutely essential. Every action has consequences, and taking responsibility is an important part of the rehabilitation process. But accountability and growth can happen at the same time, or one doesn't cancel out the other. They can grow parallelly to each other. And the next step is helping the young person identify the strengths, not to praise the offense, but to understand the abilities that exist underneath the behavior, the offense that they have committed. Like, for example, can they think ahead? Can they solve problems? Can they learn quickly? Can they stay focused on one task? Can they work well with others? These questions matter because they help us understand where that young person's potential might lie. And once we identify those strengths, the goal is to give them opportunities to use them in healthier ways. For one young person, that might be like continuing their education if they are interested in studies. For another, it might be learning a vocational skill. Some may discover confidence through sports. Others may enjoy art, music, technology, mechanics, or entrepreneurship. The activity itself isn't the most important part. What's important is that they begin experiencing success through something constructive or productive rather than something destructive. Another important part of rehabilitation is teaching emotional skills. Many young people know how to think logically, but struggle to manage emotions like anger, rejection, humiliation, or frustration. In moments of these intense emotion, good thinking can become focused on making a harmful decision rather than a healthy one. That's why therapy also focuses on emotional regulation, um, like emotional regulation such as communication skills, empathy, conflict resolution, and learning healthier ways to respond when there's a disagreement or when life becomes difficult. And this isn't something that mental health professionals do alone. Families also have a role, schools have a role, communities also have a role. So, when young people have supportive adults who notice both their struggles and their strengths, they are far more likely to develop healthier identities and healthier alternatives or healthier goals. Of course, rehabilitation doesn't guarantee that every young person will change. Human behavior, as I told you, is very complex, and lasting change requires willingness, support, and most importantly, consistent effort from their side without giving up. But I do believe that every young person deserves the opportunity to be guided towards a better path. Because if we only focus on punishment, we may stop the behavior for a while, not permanently. But if we combine accountability with understanding, guidance, and opportunities to grow, we have a much better chance of helping that young person build a different future. And ultimately, that's what rehabilitation is about. Not pretending the offense never happened, not excusing harmful behavior, but recognizing that same mind which once planned something destructive, something harmful, can also learn to plan a meaningful career, solve real world problems, build healthy relationships, and contribute positively to society. Sometimes the greatest change isn't teaching someone how to think, it's helping them discover what to think for. So, lastly, if there's one message I'd like listeners to take away from today's conversation, it's this. When we look beyond the offense, we sometimes discover trends that have simply been moving in the wrong direction. Recognizing those trends doesn't minimize the seriousness of what happened, it simply gives us another way of understanding rehabilitation. Instead of asking only how do we stop this behavior, we can also ask how do we help this young person use the same abilities to build a better future for themselves and uh, for the society? Because planning, intelligence, and problem solving are powerful qualities. When they are guided by empathy, responsibility, and healthy values, they can help someone create a meaningful life instead of destroying one. So, thank you for listening to another episode of Understanding Young Minds. I hope today's discussion encouraged you to look beyond labels, ask deeper questions, and appreciate the importance of rehabilitation alongside responsibility and accountability. So, I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very
Dr.
much. Yeah, thank you very much, Ayesha ji, for such a beautiful, taking such a, very sensitive topic as well, a delicate topic, and bringing in the best out of it. So, thank you very much. I appreciate the efforts and appreciate the research on your side. Thank you very much. So, we will look forward to seeing you on another episode very soon. So, until then, see you. Bye bye. Thank you very
Bye
much.
bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.